The boarding process for the flight was already chaotic, with passengers streaming down the narrow jet bridge like a river trying to find its way through rocks. Families juggled oversized carry-ons, business travelers tapped impatiently on their phones, and children darted between legs laughing as if they were at a playground rather than an airport. The hum of chatter mixed with the occasional squeak of rolling suitcases created a symphony of organized chaos. It was just another day at the terminal, but for those who had been waiting hours to board, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Amara stood near the gate, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone while clutching her small backpack close to her chest. She wasn't one to complain about delays. She'd learned long ago that patience was key when dealing with air travel, but today felt different. There was something in the air, a sense that this journey might not be as smooth as she'd hoped. Still, she brushed off the feeling and focused on the positives. This trip marked the end of months of hard work. She was finally heading home after wrapping up a major project abroad. All she wanted now was to settle into her seat, relax, and enjoy the view from 35,000 feet. As soon as the gate agent announced Group 4, Amara stepped forward, presenting her boarding pass with a polite smile. Her seat assignment flashed across the screen, 23A, a window seat. Perfect. She loved having the window. It meant uninterrupted views of the clouds and no one climbing over her to get up mid-flight. As she made her way down the aisle, weaving past slower-moving passengers, she couldn't help but feel a small surge of satisfaction. After weeks of early mornings and late nights, she deserved this little slice of comfort. When she reached row 23, Amara slid her backpack under the seat in front of her and settled into her spot by the window. Leaning back slightly, she glanced out at the tarmac, watching ground crew members scurry around the plane. Everything seemed normal enough. But then, just as she was pulling out her book, movement caught her eye. A man approached the row, towing a small girl behind him. They looked tired but determined, the kind of weary that comes from traveling with kids. The man scanned the row, his brow furrowing as he realized where they were seated. "Excuse me," the man said, addressing Amara directly. His voice carried a tone that was somewhere between polite and commanding, a mix that immediately set her on edge. "I see you're in the window seat here. My daughter and I are assigned to this row too. She's got the middle seat next to you. Would you mind switching so we can sit together?" Amara looked up, meeting his gaze. He was taller, than average, with broad shoulders and an air of authority that suggested he was used to getting what he asked for. His daughter, meanwhile, clung to his hand, wide-eyed and quiet. Amara took a moment to assess the situation before responding. She knew exactly what he was asking. He wanted her to give up her coveted window seat so he could sit beside his child. While it wasn't an unreasonable request on the surface, there was something about the way he phrased it that rubbed her the wrong way. "I'm sorry," Amara replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. "I prefer the window seat. I booked it specifically because I wanted to have some space during the flight." She offered him a tight smile, hoping that would be the end of it. But instead of accepting her answer, the man hesitated, his expression shifting ever so slightly. What started as a casual request began to morph into something more insistent. "Well, I understand that," he said, his tone sharpening just a fraction. "But it's really important for me to sit next to my daughter. It's only fair, don't you think?" He gestured vaguely toward the little girl who stared up at Amara with curious eyes. The implication hung heavy in the air. Surely you wouldn't deny a father the chance to sit with his child. Amara felt a flicker of irritation but kept her composure. She'd encountered situations like this before. People assuming that because she was black, she should automatically acquiesce to their demands. She refused to let anyone make her feel less entitled to her own choices simply because of the color of her skin. Taking a deep breath, she responded, "I completely understand wanting to sit with your daughter. However, I also chose my seat, intentionally, and I'd like to keep it." Her words seemed to catch the man off guard. For a split second, he looked uncertain, as though he hadn't anticipated resistance. Then, almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, the murmur of nearby passengers filled the silence. Heads turned, Curious eyes darted in their direction, and the tension in the air became palpable. For Amara, this moment wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about standing her ground, asserting her right to exist in a space without being questioned or pressured to conform to someone else's expectations. And as the seconds ticked by, she braced herself for whatever came next, knowing full well that the outcome would depend on how far this stranger was willing to push things, and whether anyone else would step in to diffuse the growing tension. The man, Greg as he would later introduce himself, didn't seem ready to back down. Instead of accepting Amara's polite but firm refusal, he leaned in slightly, his body language shifting from casual to confrontational. His voice grew louder, carrying just enough force to make it clear he wasn't used to being told no. "Look," he said, his tone sharper now. "It's not that big of a deal. Just switch seats with me. It'll be easier for everyone." Amara felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face neutral. She'd been in situations like this before, where someone expected her to step aside simply because they asked or demanded it. This time, though, something about Greg's demeanor struck a nerve. He wasn't just asking anymore. He was implying that she was being unreasonable, selfish even, for wanting to keep the seat she had paid for and chosen deliberately. "It's not about convenience," Amara replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I selected my seat when I booked my ticket, just like you did. If sitting together is important to you, maybe you should have arranged that beforehand." Her words were measured, calm, and direct, but there was an underlying strength to them, a quiet reminder that she wasn't going to be bullied into giving up what was rightfully hers. Greg blinked, momentarily thrown off by her response. For a second it seemed like he might reconsider his approach, but then his expression hardened again, and he glanced around as if seeking support from the other passengers nearby. "Come on," he pressed, his voice rising slightly. "You're an adult. Surely you can see how unfair this is. She's just a kid." He gestured toward his daughter, Sophie, who stood quietly beside him, clutching a stuffed bunny and looking increasingly confused by the exchange. Amara looked at Sophie briefly, softening her gaze for a moment. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with wide eyes and curly hair tied back in a messy ponytail. There was nothing malicious about her presence. She was just a child caught in the middle of her father's frustration. Still, Amara reminded herself that Sophie's age didn't change the fact that Greg's request was based on an assumption, that Amara's needs and preferences were less important than his own. "I understand your concern for your daughter," Amara said, choosing her words carefully, "but I've made my decision. I'm keeping my seat." She offered a small, polite smile, hoping to signal that the conversation was over. However, Greg clearly wasn't ready to let it go. His face flushed red, and his hands clenched briefly at his sides before relaxing again. To anyone watching, it was obvious that he was struggling to maintain control of the situation, and failing. By now, the tension between them had drawn the attention of several nearby passengers. A few rows ahead, a middle-aged woman turned around to watch the exchange, her eyebrows raised in curiosity. Behind them, a college student paused mid-text, glancing up from his phone to observe the unfolding drama. Even the flight attendants stationed near the front of the plane seemed to notice, their heads tilting ever so slightly in unison, as if sensing trouble brewing. Greg must have realized he was losing ground, because his next comment came out louder and more pointed than before. "You know," he said, addressing Amara but also speaking loudly enough for others to hear, "most people would do the right thing and move. It's common courtesy." That word, courtesy, hung in the air like a challenge. Amara felt a surge of irritation, but she refused to let it show. She knew exactly what he was doing, framing the issue in a way that painted her as the villain while positioning himself as the reasonable, well-intentioned parent. It was a tactic she'd seen before, one designed to make her feel guilty or defensive. But guilt wasn't an emotion she owed to anyone. Not here, not now. Common courtesy works both ways, Amara countered, her voice still calm but carrying a slight edge. "I chose my seat fairly, and I'm entitled to keep it. If you wanted to ensure you could sit with your daughter, That's something you should have coordinated earlier. I'm sorry, but it's not my responsibility to fix this for you. Her reply silenced Greg for a moment, leaving him standing there with his mouth half open, searching for a rebuttal. Nearby passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, in agreement with Amara, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted noticeably, the initial hum of boarding chatter replaced by a charged silence that made every word feel heavier. Sophie tugged gently on her father's sleeve, breaking the awkward standoff. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low murmur of the plane. "Can we just sit?" She sounded tired, her earlier excitement dulled by the mounting tension. Greg glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly, but only for a moment. When he looked back at Amara, his jaw was set, his frustration palpable. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. Then, without another word, he guided Sophie to their assigned seats, settling her into the middle spot beside Amara. As he took his place in the aisle seat, he avoided making eye contact with either of them, focusing instead on adjusting his bag and fiddling with the armrest. For a few minutes, the row fell silent. Amara stared out the window, trying to regain her composure and push aside the lingering annoyance. Sophie sat quietly beside her, occasionally sneaking glances at Amara but saying nothing. Despite the weight of the confrontation, the little girl's presence softened the mood somewhat. Amara found herself wondering how much Sophie truly understood about what had just happened, and whether Greg's actions were teaching her lessons he might later regret. Meanwhile, Greg stewed in his seat, his frustration simmering just below the surface. Every glance he stole at Amara only fueled his irritation, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Was it because she had refused to budge? Or was it something deeper, some ingrained expectation that she should have deferred to him without question? Whatever the reason, it was clear that the situation wasn't resolved. It was merely paused, waiting for the next spark to ignite it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the flight attendants began their usual safety demonstrations, reminding passengers to stow their belongings and fasten their seatbelts. Yet beneath the routine instructions, the undercurrent of tension remained. Passengers continued to steal curious glances at row 23, sensing that the conflict between Greg and Amara was far from settled. Little did they know, the real fireworks were yet to come, and when they did, they would leave everyone on board, thinking twice about assumptions, respect, and the power of standing up for oneself. As the plane taxied down the runway, the hum of engines filled the cabin, drowning out most of the murmurs from earlier. But even with the growing noise, the tension in row 23 remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg sat stiffly in his aisle seat, arms crossed and jaw tight, while Sophie fidgeted nervously in the middle, glancing between her father and Amara. Amara, for her part, kept her gaze fixed on the window, pretending to admire the view of the tarmac outside, but acutely aware of the simmering unease around her. It was then that Linda, one of the flight attendants, made her way down the aisle. She moved gracefully, balancing a tray of complimentary snacks in one hand while scanning the rows with practiced efficiency. Linda had been working as a flight attendant for over 2 decades, and she could spot trouble brewing from miles away, or in this case, from just a few rows up. When she reached row 23, she paused, her sharp eyes taking in the rigid postures and strained expressions before addressing the group. "Everything okay here?" Linda asked brightly, her tone cheerful yet firm. It wasn't so much a question, as it was an invitation for someone to speak up if they needed help. Her presence alone seemed to shift the energy slightly, drawing attention away from the lingering tension. Greg didn't hesitate. "Not really," he said, leaning forward slightly to address Linda. His voice carried a mix of frustration and indignation, as though he'd been waiting for this exact moment to air his grievances. "This woman," he gestured toward Amara, without looking directly at her, "refused to switch seats with me so I could sit next to my daughter. She's being unreasonable." Linda raised an eyebrow ever so slightly, her professional smile unwavering. "I see," she said evenly, turning her attention to Amara. "Would you like to share your side?" Amara turned toward Linda, meeting her steady gaze. There was no hostility in the flight attendant's expression, only calm curiosity. For the first time since boarding, Amara felt a flicker of relief. Someone was finally acknowledging her perspective, not dismissing her outright or assuming fault based on appearances. "I booked my window seat intentionally," Amara explained, her voice clear and composed. "When Mr." She glanced briefly at Greg, who still hadn't introduced himself. "Asked me to switch, I explained that I prefer to stay where I am. I paid for my seat just like everyone else, and I'm entitled to keep it." Linda nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Then she turned back to Greg, her demeanor unchanged but her tone firmer. "Sir, seating assignments are final unless there's a safety issue or operational need. Passengers aren't required to give up their seats based on personal preferences or convenience." Greg blinked, caught off guard by Linda's response. He opened his mouth to argue but hesitated when he saw the look on her face, a subtle blend of authority and empathy that left no room for debate. But what about families?" he stammered, his voice tinged with desperation. "Isn't it standard practice to let parents sit with their kids? That's common sense." Linda tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "While we do our best to accommodate families during check-in and boarding, once seats are assigned, they're non-negotiable. If sitting together is important, passengers can request changes at the gate or online before the flight. Unfortunately, at this point, we have to follow the seating plan as it stands." Her explanation was polite but unyielding, leaving Greg momentarily speechless. Nearby passengers, who had been eavesdropping shamelessly, exchanged knowing glances. Some nodded, approvingly, silently commending Linda for handling the situation with grace and professionalism. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recalling times when they themselves had assumed someone would move without question. Sophie, sensing the shift in dynamics, leaned closer to Amara. "Are you mad at Daddy?" she whispered timidly, her wide eyes searching for answers. The question hung in the air, innocent yet piercing, forcing everyone within earshot to confront the emotional stakes of the argument. Amara softened immediately, recognizing that Sophie wasn't responsible for the tension. "No, sweetie," she replied gently, offering the little girl a reassuring smile. "I'm not mad at anyone. Sometimes grown-ups disagree. But it's okay. We'll figure it out." Sophie nodded solemnly, clutching her stuffed bunny tighter. Then, surprising everyone, including herself, she extended her tiny hand toward Amara. "Do you want to hold Bunny? He makes me feel better when I'm sad." The simple gesture broke through the remaining tension like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Amara chuckled softly, touched by the child's kindness. "Thank you, Sophie," she said, accepting the bunny briefly before handing it back. "That's very sweet of you." For a moment, the atmosphere in row 23 transformed. The hostility that had dominated the space dissolved into something warmer, more human. Even Greg seemed to deflate slightly, his shoulders sagging as he watched the interaction between his daughter and Amara. Perhaps, somewhere deep down, he realized how unnecessary the confrontation had been, and how much simpler things might have been if he'd approached the situation differently from the start. Linda seized the opportunity to wrap up the conversation. "If there's anything else I can assist with, please don't hesitate to ask," she said warmly, addressing all three passengers. "Otherwise, let's focus on making this flight as comfortable as possible for everyone." With that, she gave them a final nod and continued down the aisle, her tray of snacks swaying gently as she moved. As soon as Linda stepped away, the row fell silent again. But this time, the silence felt different, less charged, less hostile. Amara returned her attention to the window, feeling a renewed sense of peace despite the earlier drama. Sophie settled back into her seat, seemingly content now that the tension had eased. And Greg. Well, Greg stared straight ahead, his thoughts obscured but his body language noticeably less rigid than before. In the background, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and providing routine updates about the flight. Outside, the engines roared louder as the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the sky. Below, the cityscape shrank into miniature outlines, its bustling chaos fading into insignificance against the vast expanse of blue above. Yet even as the physical world receded, the emotional currents aboard the plane lingered. Passengers resumed their activities, reading books, scrolling through phones, chatting quietly. But many couldn't shake the memory of what had transpired in row 23. Some admired Amara's quiet strength and Linda's diplomatic handling of the situation. Others sympathized with Greg, wondering whether his intentions had simply been misunderstood. And a few reflected on their own biases and assumptions, questioning how often they too had expected others to bend to their will without considering the bigger picture. For Amara, the incident served as a reminder of the importance of standing her ground, not just for herself, but for others who might find themselves facing similar challenges. For Greg, it planted seeds of doubt about his approach, forcing him to reconsider the line between assertiveness and entitlement. And for Sophie, it offered a lesson in empathy and kindness, proving that even in moments of conflict, connections could still be forged. As the plane climbed higher, the horizon stretched endlessly ahead, a fitting metaphor for the journey each passenger was navigating, both physically and emotionally. Though the turbulence of takeoff had passed, the ripple effects of row 23's drama would continue to resonate long after the wheels touched down. The flight had settled into a steady rhythm, the hum of the engines creating a soothing white noise that seemed to lull most passengers into a state of calm. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, painted in soft hues of blue and white as clouds, drifted lazily beneath the plane. Inside, however, the atmosphere in row 23 remained subtly charged, though the earlier confrontation had given way to a fragile truce. Greg sat stiffly in his aisle seat, his body language betraying a mix of frustration and reflection. Every now and then, he glanced at Amara out of the corner of his eye as if trying to gauge her mood or perhaps rehearsing what he might say next. But for now, he stayed silent, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest in an unconscious rhythm. Sophie, meanwhile, had grown more comfortable in her middle seat. She alternated between coloring in a small notebook and sneaking shy smiles at Amara, who responded with warm nods and occasional words of encouragement. Amara, for her part, exuded quiet confidence. She leaned back against the window seat, occasionally gazing out at the breathtaking view below. The tension from earlier had ebbed, replaced by a sense of resolution. Yet she couldn't help but notice the lingering unease in Greg's demeanor or the curious glances from nearby passengers who were still piecing together what had happened. Though she didn't seek validation from others, it was hard not to feel a twinge of satisfaction knowing that Linda, the flight attendant, had backed her up so decisively. It was during one of these reflective moments that Linda reappeared, making her rounds through the cabin with bottled water and snacks. When she reached row 23, she paused again, her professional smile unwavering, but her eyes sharp with awareness. "How are we doing here?" she asked warmly, addressing all three passengers, but lingering slightly longer on Amara. "We're fine," Amara replied smoothly, offering a polite smile. Her tone carried a subtle hint of finality, signaling that the matter was closed, at least as far as she was concerned. Sophie piped up enthusiastically, holding up her half-finished drawing. "Look, miss, I made a picture of the airplane." The innocence in her voice cut through any residual tension like a knife, drawing involuntary smiles from both Amara and even Greg. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Linda said, leaning down to admire the artwork. "You're very talented." Then turning her attention to Greg, she added gently, "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Greg hesitated, clearly torn between pride and the desire to smooth things over. Finally, after a long pause, he shook his head. "No, thank you," he muttered, his voice quieter than before. There was a flicker of regret in his expression, though whether it stemmed from embarrassment or genuine remorse was unclear. Linda nodded approvingly and moved on, leaving behind a palpable sense of closure. As she disappeared down the aisle, the dynamic in row 23 shifted once more. For the first time since boarding, the trio seemed to relax, each occupying their own space without the weight of unresolved conflict hanging over them. Slowly but surely, Sophie began bridging the gap between her father and Amara. Whether consciously or instinctively, the little girl sensed an opportunity to ease the lingering awkwardness. "Do you like airplanes, miss?" she asked Amara, her voice bright and eager. Amara turned toward her, her face lighting up with genuine warmth. "I do," she replied. "They let us see the world from above, don't they? It's magical." Sophie nodded vigorously. "My daddy says pilots are superheroes because they fly so high." "Well, your daddy's right about that," Amara said with a chuckle, glancing briefly at Greg. He met her gaze this time, offering a hesitant but appreciative smile. In that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement of how far they'd come since the tense standoff earlier. Encouraged by the positive energy, Sophie continued chatting animatedly, sharing stories about her favorite cartoons, her school friends, and her dreams of becoming an artist when she grew up. Amara listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions and offering gentle encouragement. Watching the interaction, Greg couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. His initial reaction to Amara had been harsh and presumptuous, yet here she was, treating his daughter with kindness and patience. As the hours ticked by, the conversation flowed more naturally. Greg, too, began joining in, albeit cautiously at first. He shared anecdotes about Sophie's antics and admitted, with a sheepish grin, that traveling with kids wasn't always easy. Amara responded with understanding, recounting her own experiences of navigating crowded airports and delayed flights. Slowly, the barriers between them began to crumble, replaced by a tentative camaraderie born out of shared humanity. By the time dinner service rolled around, the tension in row 23 felt like a distant memory. The flight attendant circulated with trays of meals, and Linda returned to check on her passengers. This time, when she approached, her smile was wider, her posture more relaxed. "Looks like we've got a happy row here," she remarked, handing out meal packets. "It's getting there," Greg admitted, surprising even himself with the admission. He shot Amara a sideways glance, adding quietly, "Thanks for being patient earlier. I realize now that I could have handled things better." Amara inclined her head graciously, accepting his apology without hesitation. "We all have moments where we react strongly," she said diplomatically. "What matters is how we move forward." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound, prompting Greg to reflect further. He realized that his insistence on switching seats hadn't just been about convenience. It had been rooted in expectations shaped by societal norms and personal biases. Seeing Amara stand her ground had forced him to confront those assumptions, challenging him to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. For Sophie, the transformation was equally significant. By the end of the meal, she was laughing freely, her earlier shyness completely gone. At one point, she leaned over to show Amara a new drawing she'd made, a colorful depiction of the plane with stick figures labeled Daddy, Me, and Miss. Amara laughed softly, touched by the gesture. "This is beautiful, Sophie," she said sincerely. "You'll make a great artist someday." As the plane cruised steadily toward its destination, the sun began its slow descent, casting golden rays across the cabin. Passengers stretched, yawned, and prepared for the final leg of the journey. In row 23, the atmosphere was peaceful, almost serene. What had started as a contentious encounter had evolved into something unexpected, a lesson in empathy, respect, and the power of human connection. Even as the flight neared its conclusion, the ripple effects of the drama continued to resonate. Nearby passengers whispered amongst themselves, marveling at how gracefully the situation had been resolved. Some expressed admiration for Amara's composure, while others commended Linda for her fairness and professionalism. A few even approached Amara directly to commend her for standing her ground, their words reinforcing the importance of advocating for oneself in the face of unfair demands. For Greg, the experience left a lasting impression. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to disembark, he found himself reflecting on the lessons he'd learned, not just about seating arrangements, but about privilege, assumptions, and the value of treating others with dignity. He knew he wouldn't forget this flight anytime soon, and neither would his daughter, whose innocent observations had helped mend fences in ways no adult intervention could have achieved. When the plane finally touched down, the usual flurry of activity ensued. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, retrieved their bags from overhead compartments, and lined up in the aisles, eager to reach solid ground. But in row 23, there was a moment of quiet significance before the chaos took over. Greg extended his hand to Amara, his expression sincere. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Amara accepted the handshake with a nod, her smile genuine. "Safe travels," she replied softly, and with that, they parted ways. Three strangers, whose paths had crossed briefly but profoundly, leaving each of them changed in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. As the plane taxied to a stop at the gate, the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign turning off echoed through the cabin. Passengers began stirring, stretching stiff limbs and reaching for their carry-ons. The energy shifted from the quiet hum of cruising altitude to the bustling anticipation of arrival. In row 23, however, there was a lingering sense of connection that set it apart from the rest of the plane. Greg stood first, carefully pulling his bag from the overhead compartment while keeping an eye on Sophie, who was already squirming in her seat, eager to disembark. Amara remained seated for a moment longer, tucking her book back into her backpack and taking one last glance out the window. She felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction, not just because the flight had ended, but because the situation she'd been thrust into had resolved itself in a way that felt meaningful. It wasn't often that confrontations like this turned into moments of growth. But here they were, three strangers who had somehow managed to find common ground. Before Greg could step into the aisle, he paused, turning back toward Amara with an expression that mirrored both gratitude and humility. "Listen," he began, his voice low but earnest. "I want to apologize again for everything. I realize now that I came across as entitled. That wasn't my intention, but I see how it must have seemed." Amara looked up at him, her face calm and open. She appreciated the sincerity in his words, even if they couldn't undo what had happened earlier. "Apology accepted," she said simply, meeting his gaze. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." Greg nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you," he added, his tone softer now. "And thank you for being kind to Sophie. She really likes you." At the mention of her name, Sophie popped up beside her father, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. "Miss Amara, will we ever see you again?" she asked, her wide eyes filled with a childlike hopefulness. Amara smiled warmly, touched by the question. "Maybe someday," she replied gently. "The world is big, but it's also small sometimes. You never know." Sophie beamed at that, clearly delighted by the possibility. Then, surprising everyone, including herself, she threw her arms around Amara in a quick hug before darting back to her father's side. The gesture was spontaneous and heartfelt, leaving Greg momentarily speechless. He glanced at Amara, his lips curving into a faint smile. "She's a good kid," he said proudly. "But I think she learned something important today, about kindness, fairness, and treating people the way they deserve." Amara nodded thoughtfully. "Kids are amazing like that," she remarked. "They remind us of the things adults sometimes forget." With that, Greg ushered Sophie into the aisle, where they joined the slow-moving line of passengers heading toward the exit. As they disappeared ahead, Amara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. Though the encounter had been challenging, it had also been unexpectedly rewarding, a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there's always room for understanding and growth. Once off the plane, the terminal buzzed with activity. Travelers reunited with loved ones, hurried toward connecting flights, or lined up at baggage claim. Amara spotted Linda near the jet bridge, assisting an elderly passenger with their luggage. Catching her eye, Linda gave her a subtle nod and, A warm smile, silently acknowledging the role she'd played in diffusing the earlier tension. Amara returned the gesture, grateful not only for Linda's professionalism but also for her unwavering support during a difficult moment. As Amara made her way through the crowded terminal, she noticed several passengers who had witnessed the drama in row 23 stopping to commend her. One woman approached her directly, saying, "I just wanted to say I admired how you handled yourself back there. You were calm and respectful, and honestly, it inspired me." Others nodded in agreement, some sharing similar stories of times when they'd faced unreasonable demands or unfair treatment themselves. These interactions reinforced what Amara already knew. Standing your ground isn't just about asserting your rights, it's about setting an example for others. Every act of courage, no matter how small, has the potential to spark change. And though she hadn't set out to make a statement that day, her actions had resonated with those around her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, Greg and Sophie navigated the terminal together, their steps lighter than before. Greg carried Sophie on his shoulders, her giggles echoing through the corridor as they searched for their connecting gate. Despite the long journey ahead, Greg couldn't shake the lessons he'd learned on that flight. He realized now how easy it was to fall into patterns of entitlement, to assume that others should accommodate him simply because it suited his needs. But seeing Amara stand firm and later extend grace despite his behavior had forced him to reevaluate his approach to life's challenges. "Daddy," Sophie chirped from above, tugging on his hair playfully. "Do you think Miss Amara will come visit us someday?" Greg chuckled softly, adjusting her position on his shoulders. "I don't know, sweetheart," he admitted, "but maybe we'll write her a thank you note instead. Would you like that?" "Yes," Sophie exclaimed, clapping her hands excitedly. "And we can draw pictures too." The idea brought a smile to Greg's face, not just because of Sophie's enthusiasm, but because it reminded him of the importance of gratitude. Writing to Amara wouldn't undo his earlier missteps, but it would serve as a reminder, to himself and to his daughter, that kindness and accountability go hand in hand. In the days that followed, Amara found herself reflecting on the flight, more often than she expected. It wasn't the confrontation itself that stuck with her, but the humanity that emerged from it. People weren't defined solely by their worst moments. They were shaped by how they responded to them. Greg's eventual apology, Sophie's innocent charm, and Linda's steadfast fairness, all of it had contributed to a story worth remembering. Inspired by the experience, Amara decided to share her side of the story online. She wrote a thoughtful post detailing the events of the flight, emphasizing not the conflict but the resolution. She highlighted the importance of mutual respect, the value of standing up for oneself, and the power of empathy in bridging divides. To her surprise, the post quickly gained traction, sparking conversations across social media platforms. Readers praised her composure, shared their own experiences, and expressed gratitude for the reminder that even in tense situations, compassion can prevail. One commenter wrote, "Your story reminded me of a time when I was asked to give up my seat on a train. I didn't feel comfortable doing so, but I doubted myself afterward. Reading your account helped me realize that it's okay to advocate for yourself without guilt." Another added, "This is such an important message for everyone to hear. We need more stories like yours to remind us of the impact our actions can have on others." For Amara, the overwhelming response was both humbling and empowering. She hadn't sought recognition, but knowing that her experience had resonated with so many people made her feel hopeful. Change often starts with small acts of courage, and if her story could inspire even one person to stand up for themselves, or treat someone else with more kindness, it would have been worth sharing. Months later, Amara received a package in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter and a colorful drawing. The letter read, "Dear Miss Amara, thank you for being so nice to me on the airplane. My daddy says you taught him something important about being fair and kind. I drew this picture of our airplane because I miss you. I hope we meet again someday. Love." Sophie beneath the letter was the drawing, a vibrant depiction of the plane complete with stick figures labeled Daddy Me, and Miss Amara. Amara felt tears prick her eyes as she studied the artwork, struck by its simplicity and sincerity. She pinned it to her bulletin board, a cherished reminder of the unexpected connections life sometimes brings. That same week, Greg reached out via social media, thanking Amara once again for her grace and patience. He explained that Sophie had insisted on sending the drawing and promised to continue fostering the values they'd discussed during their brief encounter. "You've left a lasting impression on us," he wrote. "Thank you for helping us grow." Though their paths might never cross again, the bond they'd formed on that flight endured, a testament to the power of empathy, accountability, and human connection. And as Amara tucked Greg's message away, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest ripples.